Hi there, this is John here, and I'm doing a follow-up video on a video response that I did to Chris to evidence. The original video was around an experientialist critique of evidentialism, and this is a follow-up video to that. Now, for those who haven't seen my original video, I'm just going to do a very quick summary of the arguments that I put forward. The first argument is that we are inherently experiential beings, and one of the really important core is that we as human beings have the ability to be aware. And one of the statements I made was this: I'm aware, therefore I am. I'm aware of feelings, emotions, sensations. I'm aware of all the information from the five senses. I'm aware of an inner world, and I'm aware of the outer world in which I live. So that's the heart of the experientialist approach. I think is that I'm aware, therefore I am. The second main thrust of the argument is that how we learn conceptual meaning, and that we do so by firstly taking experience in, and then we learn words and we put words to that experiencing. So a baby, for example, will initially feel hunger, and later on it can then put words to that experiencing. It can synthesize conceptual meaning by infusing experiencing with language to create conceptual meaning. And then the third thing that I argued was that what Chris or Mr. Evidence calls physical evidence is actually a subset of a much broader experiential process. That physical evidence is simply a way of describing our experience of the outer world in which we live, but it's a part of a whole range of experiencing. So I'm going to continue with this argument, and I'm going to be looking much more in depth at the evidence of or the type of experiences, rather, experiencing that comes under the big broad heading of spirituality. And I'm going to start off, first of all, with a couple of quotations that I like very much. One is from Einstein, and that is that that logic of itself cannot tell us anything about the world in which we live. Everything starts with experience and ends with experience. And I'm quoting that not because if Einstein says it, it must be true, because obviously that isn't the case. I'm quoting it because I think it's true. I only have to look at the way babies grow and develop, and we see that they're experiencing beings, and experiencing is primary to everything else. The second quote that I'm wanting to just offer is from the late Carl Rogers, who was founder of person-centered counselling. And this particular quotation is about person-centered counselling, but it could be about a whole range of other of other disciplines as well. He says this, the fragile flower of theory springs from the solid soil of experience. And indeed, experiencing is the solid soil from which all our theories about life, the universe, and everything spring. So, some people, for example, I have a friend of mine who's atheist, or at least an agnostic, materialist. A friend of mine would argue, well, there's no evidence for God, or there's no evidence for the spiritual. So I'm going to be tackling that head on. And probably the best way of tackling that is by talking about the range of experiencing that can come under this big broad heading of spirituality. I'm going to draw on just a few examples to illustrate the points that I'm making. So the first example I'm going to give you is a story of a man who, it's not my friend, it's someone else, who doesn't actually believe in God or gods, doesn't believe in life after death. But he tells of an experience that he had. He was at a funeral and he saw, in a way, he saw an elderly deceased relative walk into the funeral and sit in a particular chair. And he noticed that various participants in the funeral, people coming in, tried to sit in the chair and just couldn't stay there. Now, it's very interesting because this story illustrates the interaction between our beliefs and our experiencing. This man believes that his experiencing of that, although it was very real and it was very vivid, was a hallucination. In other words, he hasn't allowed his experiencing, he hasn't allowed the evidence of his own experiencing to change his core beliefs. Now there are, this illustrates, if you like, the relationship between core beliefs and experiencing. Sometimes we can have quite fixed beliefs and evidence comes in to contradict those beliefs, but we then perhaps we rationalise and we produce an alternative explanation consistent with our beliefs. There are at least two possible other explanations to the evidence, or at least to our beliefs. One is that somebody experiencing that might go from disbelief to agnosticism, or maybe the experience was valid, maybe it's an indicator that consciousness doesn't die with the body. Maybe it's true and maybe it isn't. Or, of course, other people, on having one or more types of this evidence, may indeed switch completely to being a believer. Excuse me, my nose itches. But it's interesting that this is experiencing. This is, and these types of experiences are extremely widespread indeed. Of course, in our materialistic Western culture, they're not looked well upon. David Hay, when he did lots of investigations into this type of thing, actually found that people were initially very reluctant to admit to spiritual and numinous type experiencing until he managed to gain their trust. His book is called Exploring Inner Space. But that's evidence. The key question is not whether evidence exists, but what we make of the evidence and how we interpret the evidence. I'll give you another example from William West. William West is a Quaker and a counsellor, and he's written a very interesting book on counselling and spirituality. One of the stories that William West tells is that he was counselling a client, getting absolutely nowhere with the client, and then has this very vivid picture of a dog being locked in a cellar, a dog being beaten and then locked in a cellar. And despairing of making any progress with this client, and the experience of this picture was so off the wall, he decided to share it. And when he shared it with the client, the therapy immediately changed, and out came a story of how as a boy he used to be beaten and locked in a cellar by his deranged mother. Now, what's happening here? Could this be evidence of some sort of spirituality, some sort of knowledge revealed? Was it intuition? The evidence itself could be explained in terms of a sort of naturalistic explanation, that we're all interconnected with each other, and that he's picking up information. It could be explained more in spiritual terms, spiritual insights. The evidence is quite clear, but the key question is, what exactly is it evidence of? And how we interpret something like that will depend on our beliefs. I'm going to give you another example. This time it's a couple of examples from myself. When I did the talk at my mother's funeral, I had a vivid sense of her presence. I had a vivid sense of her being there with me, inspiring my words. I have a friend who's sort of materialistic agnostic, who says, John, this sense of presence was really a product of your brain. You were thinking about her, you were having memories of her. This was the funeral. This is the explanation. Now, of course, that explanation is perfectly possible. It's perfectly reasonable, it's perfectly rational. But it's not the only explanation that explains the evidence. And I'm using the word evidence quite deliberately. Another explanation is perhaps that something survives the death of the body, the essence of the person, and maybe can communicate. Now, it's very interesting when you apply verification and falsification to both of those explanations as to the evidence, because Steve's explanation, and which springs, I think, from his materialistic beliefs, is, of course, perfectly reasonable, perfectly valid, as is my own explanation. His belief that there is no existence following death of the body is falsifiable if it's false, but not verifiable if it's true, because there's no one there to verify it. My beliefs are verifiable if they're true, but they're not falsified if they're false, because no one survives to falsify it. But they are certainly both meaningful explanations of the evidence. I'll give you one more from my own from my own experience. Frequently in my own life history, I've had what I can only describe as a sense of presence, a sense of that there's something benevolent in the room with me. It's come at very dark times in my life. It also came quite frequently when I used to visit Mum in the nursing home when she was dying, and I sensed it, and I'm sure that she sensed it too. Now, quite clearly, this sense of presence, this numinous experience, it's evidence, but the question is, what is it evidence of? Do I take that sense of presence at face value, or do I say that it's a product of my interaction with my environment? It's a product of my brain. Now, the whole point that I'm making here is that there is lots and lots and lots of evidence. The key question is, what exactly is it evidence of? How do we understand and interpret that evidence? What do we believe about that evidence? So yes, from an experientialist perspective, there is plenty of evidence. These phenomena are near universal experiences. It's only in the materialistic Western culture that these things are quite often looked down upon, despised. If you're intelligent, then you really shouldn't be making these types of statements. There is the whole fear of being labelled as mentally ill or mentally deficient if you admit to these experiences. And yet, in previous cultures, these experiences, this evidence, would have been treated, if you like, as normal. So this is another contribution, if you like, to the debate, and I'm interested in the response, in any responses to it. Thanks for listening.